The morning sun always touched the ridge first, spilling its gold across the mossy stones before sliding down to the hollow where Evelyn Marsh's cottage sat hidden between the trees. The sound of the spring was the rhythm of her days, a low whisper beneath the wind, constant, familiar, alive. For more than 80 years it had poured from the earth behind her garden, running through a narrow wooden channel her late husband had built by hand, feeding the same families that had lived in the valley for generations. Children had learned to swim in its shallow basin, old men still filled their jugs there before dawn, and Evelyn had always said that as long as the water flowed, this place would never die. She remembered how her father once told her that the spring was older than the town itself, that it rose from an underground river that no drought could silence. Now, at 62, with her hands marked by time and the smell of wet stone clinging to her sleeves, she tended it every morning like someone tending a memory. She would crouch beside the basin, clear away the fallen leaves, and listen to the murmur as though her husband's voice were hidden in the sound. People called her the Keeper of the Spring, and she wore the title quietly, without pride but with the kind of devotion that comes only from love. The valley was changing, though, and Evelyn had felt it long before she saw the signs. New houses had risen on the hillsides, pale, box-shaped things with glass fences and paved driveways, owned by people who never waved back. The old gravel road had been resurfaced, the oak grove where children used to play had been trimmed into neat lines, and at the edge of the neighborhood a polished sign now read, "Welcome to Maple Ridge Estates, managed by Willow Creek HOA." The letters gleamed like they owned the light. When the Homeowners Association had first formed, Evelyn hadn't paid it much mind. Her cottage predated every modern boundary, and the deed clearly stated that her land and the spring behind it were private and exempt. But the letters started coming anyway, pamphlets about community improvements, requests for voluntary contributions, warnings about non-compliant landscaping. She ignored them, believing that reason would protect what was sacred. It was, after all, a natural spring, a public resource long before bylaws and property codes were invented. That morning, she awoke to a sound that didn't belong. Down by the hollow, where the mist usually hovered, there were men in fluorescent vests standing around the water's edge, their boots sinking into the mud. Orange cones circled the spring like a trap, and beside them stood a concrete mixer, its drum spinning lazily. A new sign had been planted into the ground, white letters on red plastic. Construction area. Authorized personnel only. For a second, Evelyn thought it must be some mistake, that perhaps the county had sent workers to repair the retaining wall. But then one of the men gestured toward her when she called out, and she saw the emblem on his vest. HOA Maintenance Division. She walked down the slope, her boots slipping on the damp grass, her heart pounding in disbelief. The man in charge barely looked at her when she demanded to know what they were doing. "Safety work," he said, his tone flat as if reading from a manual. "This spring's been deemed unsanitary and unsafe for residential use. We're sealing it per directive." Evelyn felt the words strike her like stones. "Sealing?" she repeated, staring at the spinning drum. "That water supplies 12 families. You can't just pour concrete into it." He shrugged and turned back to his crew. The hose was already uncoiled, the thick gray mixture beginning to flow toward the basin. Evelyn ran forward, her voice breaking as she shouted for them to stop. But one of the workers blocked her path. "Ma'am, you're trespassing on regulated property," he said coldly. She could smell the dust of cement in the air, bitter and final. At that moment she noticed a dark sedan parked near the road, a man inside watching through tinted windows. The door opened, and out stepped Glenn Reed, the newly elected president of the HOA, in his polished shoes and neatly pressed jacket. His smile was narrow and careful, like a blade wrapped in paper. "Mrs. Marsh," he said as if greeting a guest, "this is for everyone's good. The water's not safe anymore. We'll be installing a modern system soon. Filtered, regulated, efficient. You'll have running water from the city line before the week's out." Evelyn looked past him at the men who were now filling the heart of the spring, covering the stones that had known her whole life. "That's not your water," she said quietly, but her voice trembled with anger. "It never was." Glenn's expression didn't change. "Everything within Maple Ridge jurisdiction falls under our responsibility," he replied. "You should be grateful, really. Progress can't wait for sentiment." Evelyn stood there as the first layer of concrete swallowed the water, the sound of the spring fading beneath the mechanical churn. She felt something inside her fracture, a silence so heavy it seemed to pull the world down with it. The stream that had carried her childhood, her marriage, her community, was vanishing before her eyes. The men worked quickly, their movements practiced, and within an hour the basin was gone, replaced by a flat gray surface that steamed in the morning light. Glenn Reed gave a satisfied nod, checked his watch, and walked back to his car. Evelyn remained rooted to the ground, staring at the spot where the water used to shimmer. The only thing that remained was a faint trace of moisture leaking through the cracks, as though the earth itself refused to surrender. She knew then that this was not the end of a spring. It was the beginning of a war. The next days unfolded with the numb slowness of grief, the kind that arrives not from death but from the desecration of something sacred. Evelyn could still hear the echo of machinery in her head long after the workers had gone, a metallic hum that haunted her every step. The concrete slab behind her garden looked alien, obscene, like a wound in the earth that refused to heal. Each morning she went there anyway, standing motionless before the gray surface, waiting for the familiar gurgle that would never return. The valley was quiet now, too quiet, as though nature itself were holding its breath. By the third day, her phone began to ring. It was her neighbor, Thomas Greeley, his voice strained and tired, telling her that the water line from the spring had stopped running and that his family had no water left. Soon after, the McAllisters called, then the Fords, then the elderly couple who lived near the church. 12 families, all of them relying on the same underground flow that the HOA had just smothered under concrete. The panic in their voices carried the same disbelief that still clung to her. "They said it was a maintenance project," Thomas told her, "but they've shut everything off. We called the city, and they said it's not their jurisdiction. They told us to talk to the homeowners association." Evelyn hung up and sat in silence for a long while before reaching for her old file cabinet. Inside, wrapped in yellowing folders and faded plastic sleeves, were the original documents for the property. The deed, signed in 1942, the hydrographic survey her husband had contributed to in the 70s, the permit from the state environmental office confirming the spring as a protected natural water source. Every line of those papers confirmed what she already knew. The HOA had no legal claim over that spring. Her property was exempt, its boundaries drawn decades before the community had ever existed. When she arrived at the HOA office that afternoon, the secretary behind the glass window looked at her with that sterile politeness that bureaucracies wear like armor. Evelyn asked to see Glenn Reed, but the woman told her he was in meetings and suggested she file a written complaint instead. Evelyn slid the documents through the window slot. "Then file this," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Your association has committed environmental vandalism. You destroyed a protected source of water that belongs to this community." The secretary gave her the kind of smile reserved for troublesome citizens. "We'll be in touch," she said, sliding the papers aside as if they were irrelevant. Days passed and no one called, but the silence didn't mean inaction. It meant something worse, something deliberate. Evelyn noticed new signs along the road near her property. Construction zone. Future site of Maple Ridge Water Management Facility. A crew had begun digging trenches just beyond the ridge, installing pipes that led toward the HOA's administrative complex. It didn't take long for her to piece it together. The HOA wasn't sealing the spring for safety. They were redirecting it. The natural flow that had nourished 12 families for generations was being stolen, channeled underground to serve a private water system that residents would soon be billed for. Her disbelief hardened into rage. She called the county environmental board, the public utilities office, even the local news station. Each department passed her to another. Each official repeated the same rehearsed line. The HOA has obtained all necessary permits. But when she demanded to see the permits, they refused to share copies, citing confidentiality under the Private Infrastructure Clause. One clerk, sounding almost apologetic, told her quietly, "Ma'am, if your name's not on their member registry, you don't have standing to request records." Evelyn could feel the world twisting around her, logic bending under the weight of corporate language. She wasn't even an HOA member. Her house predated the entire development. Yet, somehow, her land was now being governed by its rules. That evening, she drove out to the ridge to see the work for herself. The sun was low, the air thick with dust and the chemical tang of wet concrete. Trucks lined the narrow road, their engines humming as workers maneuvered heavy piping into trenches. A foreman spotted her standing by the fence and shouted for her to leave the area, but she ignored him, lifting her phone to record. Through the zoom lens, she saw where the pipes ended, right at the site of the old spring. The crew had broken open the concrete slab, not to restore it, but to embed a valve assembly that would reroute the water toward the HOA's new facility. The realization struck her like cold metal. They hadn't killed the spring completely. They were siphoning its veins. She could almost hear Glenn Reed's voice in her head, smooth and precise. Progress can't wait for sentiment. When she returned home, a letter was taped to her door, printed on heavy paper with the HOA's emblem embossed in gold. It was titled Notice of Violation. The document accused her of harassment of construction personnel, obstruction of community improvement projects, and unauthorized recording on restricted property. Each alleged violation carried a fine, totaling over $2,000. At the bottom, in tidy cursive, was Glenn's signature. Evelyn crumpled the letter in her hand, her pulse roaring in her ears. It was not enough that they had buried her spring. They were now trying to bury her beneath paperwork. The next morning, when she tried to call the families again, she found that most of them were unwilling to talk. Some had already accepted temporary water delivery contracts from the HOA. Others had been warned that continued complaints might jeopardize their community benefits. Only Thomas still stood by her, his voice weary but determined. "We can't just let them do this," he said. "There has to be a law against it." Evelyn wanted to believe that, but the law was nowhere to be found. On the fourth night after the spring was sealed, she heard a vehicle pull up outside her house. Peering through the curtain, she saw a pair of men in plain clothes nailing another sign onto the fence. It read, "Property under review, pending compliance inspection." When she stepped outside to confront them, they didn't speak. One simply handed her a folded sheet before getting back into the truck. It was another letter, this one informing her that the HOA had scheduled an inspection of her property for potential environmental hazards. It was absurd. She was the one whose environment had been destroyed, but she knew the tactic: intimidation. Escalation, exhaustion. By making her the problem, they could erase the real crime. She sat awake for hours that night, the old house groaning around her, the smell of concrete still hanging in the air. Somewhere beneath that gray tomb, the spring still moved. She could feel it, its pressure building under the weight of injustice. At dawn, she went out with a spade and a bucket, ignoring the warning signs. She began to dig near the edge of the slab, her fingers blistering as she tore at the hardened soil. The ground was damp, faintly cold. She pressed her ear to it and thought she heard something, a muffled trickle, a whisper of water trying to find its way back. The sound gave her a rush of hope so sharp it hurt. She realized then that as long as the water still lived beneath, there was a chance to save it. She took a photograph of the cracked concrete and the wet soil beneath it, then another of the trenches leading away from her property. Those images would become her first pieces of evidence. What she didn't know yet was how high the wall she was about to climb would be. For every law she believed in, the HOA had a loophole. For every truth she could prove, they had paperwork to obscure it. But Evelyn Marsh was not a woman who quit. The spring was her legacy, her bloodline, her promise to the land. And as the morning light spilled across the scarred ground, she whispered to it like a vow. "They think they've buried you, but I'll make them dig you up with their own hands." Evelyn's patience began to unravel in the following weeks, torn apart by the relentless silence from every institution that should have protected her. The county clerk's office ignored her calls. The environmental department redirected her to voicemail, and even the local newspaper that had once covered community matters politely declined to get involved. The HOA's presence, meanwhile, grew stronger and more invasive. Large metal pipes now ran like veins along the main road, connected to a gleaming water control unit fenced in with barbed wire. Trucks came and went daily, leaving tire tracks and the smell of diesel across the hills. Every morning, Evelyn would stand on her porch and watch the men in orange vests climb in and out of the pit near her property line, and though none of them met her gaze, she could feel their contempt radiating like heat. One afternoon, she caught two of them walking across her garden, measuring something with a laser tool. When she demanded to know what they were doing, one muttered that they were verifying encroachment boundaries, and when she threatened to call the sheriff, he simply smiled and told her that the HOA had already notified local authorities. They were acting under approved jurisdiction, he said, as if that phrase gave them permission to desecrate whatever they touched. That night she found another letter in her mailbox. It was thinner than the others, but somehow heavier to open. The envelope contained a single printed page, an official notice stating that her property would be subject to preliminary water reclamation assessment as part of a neighborhood upgrade. At the bottom, again, was Glenn Reed's signature, his name curling like a snake around the words, "Authorized by Board Resolution." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face as she reread the letter. It was a legal attempt to redefine her spring, as a community utility. If the board's assessment succeeded, her land would be absorbed into the HOA's domain under an annexation clause. They were trying to take it from her permanently. She drove straight to the HOA office, storming through the glass doors into the sterile lobby that smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh paint. The receptionist froze as Evelyn slammed the notice onto the counter. "You tell Glenn Reed I'm not signing a damn thing," she said. "And if your people set foot on my property again, I'll have them arrested." The woman's expression didn't change. "Mr. Reed is unavailable, Mrs. Marsh," she replied evenly. "But you can request a hearing with the Compliance Committee if you wish to contest the assessment." Evelyn's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You mean the same committee that works for him?" she asked. The woman's silence was answer enough. She left the building shaking, her anger turning into something deeper and colder. On the way home, she stopped at Thomas Greeley's farm. The man looked 10 years older since the spring was filled, the lines around his eyes deepened by worry. His wife met them on the porch, carrying a bucket of cloudy water they'd been forced to haul from the nearest town tap. "We can't live like this much longer," Thomas said, rubbing his temples. "The HOA's promising to hook us up to their system next month, but it'll cost a fortune." Evelyn showed him the notice, her voice trembling with fury as she explained how the association was annexing the spring to charge everyone for something that had always been free. Thomas listened, his face darkening. "They're stealing from us in daylight," he muttered. Together, they decided to go door to door, gathering signatures from every family who had once relied on the spring. Some neighbors agreed immediately, others hesitated, afraid of retaliation, but by nightfall they had 9 names on a handwritten petition. Evelyn felt a flicker of the old strength return as she looked at the paper, each signature a spark of defiance. The next morning, she brought the petition to the county courthouse, expecting at least acknowledgement. Instead, the clerk at the filing desk frowned and told her that citizens' petitions regarding HOA governance had to be submitted through the association's own internal review process. The absurdity of it nearly broke her composure. "You're telling me we have to ask permission from the people who committed the crime," she said, voice rising. The clerk only shrugged. "I don't make the rules, ma'am." Evelyn walked out into the blinding daylight, the petition fluttering in her hand like a useless relic. When she reached her car, she found a parking ticket tucked under the wiper, issued by Maple Ridge Community Security. The fine was $75 for improper parking near restricted access. Her laughter was bitter this time, dry and hollow. They were everywhere, watching, tightening the noose one regulation at a time. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house creaked with the sound of wind pressing against the windows, and in the distance she could hear the faint hum of the new pumping system. It was the same frequency as the old spring's voice, but hollow, artificial, lifeless. She rose before dawn, pulled on her boots, and walked toward the ridge with a flashlight. The air was cold and wet, the kind that clung to the lungs. When she reached the fenced compound, she saw security lights glowing across the site, illuminating the silver piping that snaked into the ground. She pressed against the chain-link fence, peering through the gaps, and saw something that froze her where she stood. A small, open trench running directly from her property toward the facility. The pipe inside was marked with red paint and the words, "Private Flow, HOA Supply." They had tapped the underground channel without her consent. It wasn't just theft anymore. It was invasion. The next day, she hired a lawyer, a young woman named Marisa Kent who had handled environmental disputes before. Marisa studied the documents, flipping through them with growing disbelief. "They've fabricated your membership," she said finally, pointing to a section of the HOA charter that listed Evelyn's property as part of the Maple Ridge boundaries. "They've backdated the annexation file to last year. It looks official, but the timestamp's off. It was edited 3 weeks ago." Evelyn felt her chest tighten as the weight of it settled in. "Can we fight it?" she asked. Marisa hesitated. "It's possible, but it'll take time and money. And you should know. These associations have lawyers on retainer. They'll drag it out until you bleed dry." Evelyn's reply came through gritted teeth. "Then they'll learn I'm not easy to drain." The lawsuit was filed 2 days later, accusing the HOA of property fraud and illegal environmental modification. When the summons was delivered, Glenn Reed personally came to her gate. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. "You've made quite a spectacle of yourself, Mrs. Marsh," he said, adjusting his tie. "You should understand that these matters are best handled privately. Litigation will only hurt you." Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "You already hurt me," she said. "You hurt everyone who drank from that spring." Glenn's smile faltered for the first time. "You're clinging to the past," he said softly, almost kindly. "People like you don't adapt. But progress doesn't stop because of sentiment." He turned and walked away before she could answer, leaving the faint smell of cologne and asphalt in his wake. Within a week, Evelyn began receiving strange phone calls. No voice on the other end, only static, sometimes a faint mechanical hum. Her mailbox was filled with anonymous flyers advertising the HOA's new Sustainable Water Initiative. Neighbors who had signed her petition reported receiving unexpected inspection notices. The pressure campaign was subtle but unmistakable, a slow grind meant to wear them down. Yet instead of breaking, it steeled her resolve. She started at night, when exhaustion blurred the edges of her determination. She would sit by the cold, gray slab that once was her spring and whisper to the earth beneath it, promising that she would not let the silence win. And though the world around her seemed deaf to her fight, She could still feel the faint vibration under her feet. A pulse, weak but persistent, as if the spring itself were waiting for her to free it. The hearing was supposed to be routine, a procedural step before the court determined whether Evelyn's injunction against the HOA would move forward, but from the moment she stepped into the courthouse she felt the air shift. The hall smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper dust, and the people sitting on the benches outside the chamber avoided her gaze, whispering into their phones as if proximity to her case might contaminate their reputations. Marissa arrived moments later, her expression unreadable, a thick folder tucked beneath her arm. "They've filed a counterclaim," she said quietly before Evelyn could even ask. "Defamation, obstruction, unauthorized tampering with community property. They're trying to paint you as unstable." The words landed like stones, but Evelyn only nodded. She had expected as much. What she hadn't expected was how calm she felt, as though the weeks of outrage had crystallized into a cold, deliberate focus. When the clerk called her name and the doors opened, she walked into the chamber with her spine straight, the same way she used to walk behind her husband on their morning hikes along the ridge, back when life still made sense. Inside, Glenn Reed was already seated at the plaintiff's table, his suit perfectly pressed, a half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't look at her as she sat down, but she could feel his confidence radiating like heat. The judge, a gray-haired man whose nameplate read Honorable P. McKinnon, reviewed the stack of documents before him with the mechanical patience of someone accustomed to endless disputes over fences and fees. Marissa began with a clear statement, outlining the history of the spring, the century-old property deed, and the evidence that the HOA had altered records to claim ownership. She presented photographs of the sealed basin, the trench lines, the red stamped pipes. The judge listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When it was Glenn's turn, he rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and began to speak with a tone that reminded Evelyn of a salesman. Smooth, rehearsed, disarmingly polite. He claimed that the spring had been contaminated with high bacterial levels, citing a water quality report allegedly issued by a private testing firm. He argued that the HOA's intervention had been a public health necessity and that Evelyn's emotional distress was regrettable but misplaced. Then he turned toward her for the first time, his eyes calm and deliberate. "Mrs. Marsh has a long history of opposing community development," he said. "Her resistance to modernization is well known. While we respect her personal attachment to this land, her refusal to cooperate has endangered not only herself, but others." Marissa objected immediately, but Glenn's words had already planted their seed. The judge requested copies of the lab report, and Glenn's attorney handed them over with an almost ceremonial precision. The pages bore official seals and barcodes, the kind of authenticity that could silence doubt. Marissa examined them, her brow furrowing. Later, she would whisper to Evelyn that the seals looked legitimate, but the company listed no state license number, an omission subtle enough to escape most eyes. Still, the judge accepted the documents into the record. Evelyn sat there, her pulse thudding in her ears, realizing that this was more than a property dispute. It was an orchestrated narrative designed to erase her credibility. When the session adjourned, Glenn approached her briefly in the corridor, his tone almost friendly. "You see," he said softly, "it's not personal. It's structure. You can't fight the system forever." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment before replying, her voice low and steady. "Then I'll break the system open until it shows its rot." In the days that followed, Marissa dug deeper into the so-called laboratory report. Her research led them to a small office address in another county, which turned out to be an abandoned storefront. The company didn't exist. The document was fabricated, just like the annexation file. But proving forgery required official access to records they didn't have. "We need exposure," Marissa said one night as they sat in Evelyn's kitchen, surrounded by maps and photocopies, someone outside their reach, someone the HOA can't control. Evelyn hesitated only a moment before suggesting the name that had lingered in her mind for weeks. Lisa Parker. The investigative journalist had once written about a contaminated reservoir project that toppled a city council. Finding her wasn't easy. She'd left the paper after that exposé, burned by lawsuits and threats. But when Evelyn finally reached her, Lisa's voice over the phone was cautious, almost tired. "You have no idea how deep these associations run," she warned. Evelyn told her everything anyway: the filled spring, the forged documents, the silenced neighbors. There was a pause, and then Lisa sighed. "Send me what you have. If half of it checks out, I'll come down there myself." 3 days later, a weather-beaten sedan pulled into Evelyn's driveway, and Lisa stepped out with a recorder in one hand and a determined glint in her eyes. She was younger than Evelyn expected, with hair tied back and a notebook already open. "Let's start with the documents," she said briskly, setting up at the kitchen table. For hours, they went through everything, page by page. Lisa asked relentless questions: dates, names, signatures, every inconsistency. When Evelyn told her about the night she found the trench in the pipe labeled private flow, Lisa's pen stopped mid-sentence. "That's not just environmental theft," she said. "That's privatization of a natural resource. If they're selling it, they're breaking federal law." The next day, Lisa visited the site herself. She walked the ridge, photographed the pipes, even scraped samples of the concrete for testing. At one point, she crouched near the edge of the slab and placed her ear against it. "You can still hear it," she murmured. Evelyn nodded. Beneath the layers of stone and cement, a faint trickle was still alive, defiant. When Lisa's article went online 2 weeks later, it exploded across the community. The headline read, "HOA accused of destroying historic water source for profit." The story detailed everything: the fraudulent annexation, the forged lab results, the redirected water supply, and included interviews with neighbors who confirmed that the HOA had pressured them into silence. Within hours, comments flooded the post, outrage spreading faster than the HOA could respond. Local television stations arrived at Evelyn's house, their vans cluttering the road. She tried to stay calm, speaking carefully into microphones, insisting that it wasn't about revenge but about justice. For the first time since the spring was filled, she saw fear flicker in Glenn Reed's eyes when the cameras found him outside the HOA office. He issued a statement calling the allegations unfounded and defamatory, but his voice lacked the easy confidence it once carried. Then, almost as quickly as the attention had come, the pushback began. Anonymous letters appeared in Evelyn's mailbox calling her a liar. Someone painted "Old Crazy Woman" across her fence in dripping red letters. Lisa received threatening emails. Her car tires slashed one night outside her motel. The HOA board filed a motion demanding the article's retraction and hinting at a defamation lawsuit against both women. Marisa warned Evelyn to stay cautious. These people were cornered now, and cornered people could be dangerous. The pressure only strengthened Evelyn's resolve. "They buried a river," she told Lisa quietly one evening as they stood beside the gray mound that once shimmered with life. "You can't bury a river forever. It'll find its way back." Lisa smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Then, let's help it carve the way." The next morning, county inspectors unexpectedly arrived at Evelyn's property, claiming they'd received an anonymous tip about unsafe excavation. They searched her yard, photographed her tools, and warned her that unauthorized digging on HOA-regulated terrain could result in criminal charges. She realized with cold clarity that the association was now using public agencies as their weapon. Later, Lisa's contact at the State Environmental Bureau confirmed her suspicion. A private developer had applied for a zoning variance that covered the exact parcel of land where the spring lay buried. The applicant's name was redacted, but the mailing address led straight back to the law firm representing the HOA. It was no longer about water management. It was about development, the quiet transformation of a rural community into profitable real estate. That night, as a storm rolled over the valley, Evelyn sat by the window watching rain streak across the glass, each drop a ghost of what had been lost. Thunder rumbled through the hills, and for a moment she thought she heard something else beneath it, a faint gurgle like laughter in the earth. She went outside barefoot, the wind lashing her coat, and walked to the edge of the slab. The rainwater pooled on its surface, seeping into cracks that spiderwebbed across the concrete. Under the flashes of lightning, she saw the water tremble as if something below were pushing upward, struggling to breathe. The sight filled her with a wild hope that burned away her exhaustion. The spring was alive. The land hadn't surrendered. When she turned back toward the house, she saw headlights cresting the hill, a black SUV idling near her gate. The driver didn't move. She stood there, rain streaming down her face, unflinching. If Glenn Reed had come to intimidate her again, he would find that the woman he once dismissed as sentimental now carried the fury of the earth itself. The morning after the storm, the air smelled of damp earth and iron, a heavy scent that clung to everything like a warning. Evelyn woke to find her porch scattered with wet flyers bearing the HOA's emblem, each one announcing a community emergency meeting regarding water safety. Beneath the title, in smaller print, was a note that attendance was mandatory for all, residents including non-members residing within shared jurisdiction zones. It was an open provocation. They were summoning her directly. Marisa advised her not to go, saying it was a trap meant to isolate her in public, but Evelyn refused to hide. "If they want a spectacle," she said, "they'll have one." She arrived at the community center just before dusk. The parking lot was full, lined with SUVs gleaming under the streetlights. Inside, the fluorescent-lit hall buzzed with low conversation, the hum of gossip and unease. At the front stood Glenn Reed, his posture immaculate, a microphone in hand. Behind him, a projector displayed the HOA logo over an image of the spring, an old photograph taken long before the concrete. Evelyn felt her stomach twist as she realized they were using her own history as propaganda. When Glenn spotted her entering, his voice lifted a note higher, smooth and performative. He thanked everyone for attending and began speaking about recent misinformation circulated through irresponsible media channels. He claimed the spring had been a known environmental risk, that unsanctioned excavation attempts had endangered community safety, and that outside agitators were spreading falsehoods for personal gain. Every phrase was chosen like a blade meant to slice without bleeding. Then he gestured toward the audience, scanning the rows until his gaze settled on her. "Mrs. Marsh has unfortunately allowed herself to be manipulated by sensationalist journalism," he said with a regretful sigh. "We ask for compassion, not condemnation, as she navigates this difficult misunderstanding." The murmurs that followed were sharp and poisonous. Evelyn stood up slowly, feeling dozens of eyes turned toward her. "A misunderstanding," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "You poured concrete into a public water source and forged my signature to justify it. You poisoned this valley with greed." Glenn's mask slipped for a moment, just long enough for her to see the flicker of rage beneath the civility. "Please, Mrs. Marsh," he said softly, "let's not disrupt the meeting." But she didn't stop. She spoke of the fake reports, the trenches, the private water contracts, the neighbors coerced into silence. When she mentioned the secret development application, a gasp rippled through the room. Someone shouted, "Is that true?" But Glenn drowned it out by calling for order, banging his hand against the podium. Security guards stepped forward, and Evelyn felt their hands on her arms as they tried to escort her out. She pulled free just long enough to face the crowd one last time. "They buried the truth," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "But it's still there, beneath their concrete, waiting." She left before they could force her, her breath ragged as she stepped into the cold night. Rainwater still glistened on the pavement, reflecting the harsh lights of the parking lot. As she reached her car, she noticed a dark SUV parked a few spaces away. The window lowered slightly, and for an instant she thought she saw Glenn's profile, but then the glass rose again and the engine purred to life. The vehicle didn't move. It just idled, humming like an animal waiting for her to flinch. She got in her car and drove home without looking back, though her hands were trembling on the wheel. When she arrived, she found her front gate open. The padlock was broken, the hinges twisted. Inside, the garden was a mess of footprints and torn soil. Her shed door hung crooked, the lock snapped clean. Nothing seemed stolen, but the message was unmistakable. "We can reach you any time." She called Marisa, who insisted they report it to the sheriff, but the deputy who arrived looked bored, barely glancing at the damage. "Probably kids," he said, scribbling half-heartedly in his notepad. "We don't have jurisdiction over HOA property disputes." Evelyn stared at him, her voice cold. "My house isn't HOA property." The deputy gave a weary shrug. "Everything around here falls under their code now, ma'am." He left without taking a statement. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy and electric, the way it feels before lightning strikes. Around midnight, she heard a faint sound outside, the crunch of gravel under careful footsteps. She turned off the lamp and peered through the window. 3 figures moved along the fence line, flashlights darting across the yard. They wore dark uniforms without insignias, their movements methodical. One knelt by the broken gate, another scanned the house with a handheld device that blinked with red light. Evelyn's heart pounded, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone and started recording through the window, whispering the time and date. Suddenly, one of the men turned his flashlight toward her, the beam blinding her through the glass. "We see you," a voice called out, steady and calm. "You're interfering with an ongoing safety inspection." Before she could respond, they turned away and walked toward the road, their shadows swallowed by darkness. By the time the sheriff arrived the next morning, there was no trace they had ever been there except for a new notice pinned to her fence. "Unauthorized surveillance of HOA personnel. Cease and desist immediately." Lisa returned 2 days later, her face drawn with exhaustion. "They're digging deeper," she said, spreading fresh documents across the kitchen table. "I pulled records from the zoning board. There's a shell company called Clearwave Infrastructure leasing the water rights under this entire ridge. Guess who signed the transfer authorization?" Evelyn didn't need to ask. "Reed," she said quietly. Lisa nodded. "He's not just stealing the spring, he's selling it." Marisa joined them later that night, her expression grim. "The court granted a temporary freeze on their expansion permit," she said, "but it won't last long. They're lobbying at the state level to override it." Evelyn stared out the window toward the ridge, where floodlights glowed like distant fires. She felt a deep, trembling anger, not the hot rage of the first weeks, but something colder, purer, almost sacred. "Then we'll make it impossible for them to hide," she said. "If the law won't stop them, the truth will." The plan they formed was simple but dangerous. Lisa would plant hidden cameras near the excavation site, while Evelyn and Thomas would monitor from the ridge. They waited for a night without moonlight, when the sky was black enough to swallow sound. Just after midnight, the distant roar of machinery began, the HOA's crew working under cover of darkness. From their vantage point behind a cluster of pines, Evelyn watched trucks unload long metal pipes, their ends glinting in the dim floodlight. Men in reflective jackets moved with the efficiency of professionals, guided by someone giving orders from a radio. Lisa crouched beside her, holding the camera steady. "They're diverting the underground stream," she whispered. "If we catch them opening that valve, it's over." Minutes stretched into hours until finally a mechanical hiss cut through the air. One of the workers turned a large handle, and a surge of muddy water burst into the new channel, rushing toward the fenced compound below. Evelyn's throat tightened. Her spring, the lifeblood of the valley, enslaved to their pipes. Lisa kept filming, capturing every detail. The faces, the license plates, the corporate logos on the crates. Then, without warning, one of the floodlights swung toward their direction, flooding the trees with white glare. "Go!" Lisa hissed. They ran, stumbling through the underbrush as shouts erupted behind them. A flashlight beam sliced through the dark, followed by the sound of boots crashing through the brush. Evelyn's lungs burned as she reached the car, throwing herself into the passenger seat. Lisa gunned the engine, the tires spitting gravel as they sped down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, Evelyn saw figures silhouetted in the light, one of them raising a phone to take a photo. By dawn, the footage was uploaded to multiple servers and sent to every journalist Lisa trusted. They sat in silence in Evelyn's kitchen, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the clock, both knowing that once the video went public, there would be no turning back. Evelyn poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands still trembling. "They'll come harder now," Lisa said quietly. Evelyn nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then let them," she replied. "The spring's not done fighting, and neither am I." The video spread faster than anyone anticipated, igniting a storm of outrage that neither the HOA nor its president could contain. Within a day, it appeared on national feeds, shared by environmental activists, watchdog pages, and local news outlets eager for a scandal that felt both intimate and monstrous. The images were undeniable. Men in reflective vests opening underground valves, muddy water gushing into a private pipeline, Glenn Reed's signature on shipping manifests for equipment registered under Clearwave infrastructure. The story painted him not as a misguided administrator, but as an orchestrator of theft on a scale small enough to seem invisible and vast enough to poison a community. Evelyn watched the coverage from her living room, the same room where she had once listened to the steady song of the spring through the open window. Now that song was replaced by reporters' voices and the sound of rain against the shutters. She should have felt triumph, but instead she felt a weight pressing into her chest. The knowledge that truth alone never stopped men like Glenn Reed. It only enraged them. 2 nights later, she found proof of that. She had gone to bed late, unable to sleep, when she heard the distant hum of engines outside. Looking through the curtains, she saw the glow of headlights moving up the ridge toward the fenced compound. She thought it was another construction shift until she noticed the smoke. Within minutes, the night was split by orange light. Flames climbed the sky from the direction of the pipeline facility. Sirens wailed in the distance, but before the fire trucks arrived, she saw figures moving along the fence, cutting through panels and throwing something metallic into the blaze. It wasn't vandalism, it was erasure. They were destroying the evidence before investigators could seize it. Evelyn grabbed her coat and ran outside, the wind whipping her hair into her face. By the time she reached the edge of the property, the air was thick with the acrid stench of burning plastic and oil. She could barely breathe, but she kept going, screaming over the roar of the flames for them to stop. Her voice was swallowed by the inferno. A hand caught her arm. It was Thomas, coughing hard, his face streaked with soot. "You can't go closer," he shouted. "The tanks'll blow." She stumbled back, watching helplessly as the fire consumed everything. When the firefighters finally arrived, the structure had already collapsed, leaving nothing but a smoldering crater and the hiss of boiling water seeping into the ground. By morning, the news had twisted again. The HOA released a statement claiming that the explosion had been caused by unauthorized tampering by local saboteurs. The insinuation was clear. They were blaming her. A patrol car appeared outside her gate, and 2 officers knocked on her door with a warrant for questioning. Marissa arrived minutes later, intercepting them at the porch, her voice cutting through their rehearsed lines. "You don't touch her without probable cause," she said, showing the injunction papers that were still valid. The officers backed off reluctantly but warned they would return. The fear that followed was different from before. It wasn't the quiet dread of losing something sacred. It was the sharp terror of being hunted. The phone rang constantly. Reporters, strangers, threats, and each ring felt like an alarm. Evelyn barely ate, barely slept, waiting for the next strike. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was a thread of grim determination holding her upright. The spring might have been buried, but the truth was surfacing in places they couldn't control. When the state investigation began, the balance finally shifted. Lisa's footage, coupled with the zoning records and the forged environmental reports, forced regulators to freeze all HOA operations in the county. Subpoenas were issued, and suddenly board members who had once spoken with rehearsed confidence were calling their lawyers, their polished facades cracking under pressure. One contractor confessed that Glenn had ordered the destruction of the natural spring to justify redirecting the water through private meters. Another admitted the lab results were forged to manufacture the appearance of contamination. The web unraveled thread by thread until only Glenn stood in the center, his composure slipping with every revelation. He was arrested 2 weeks later on charges of fraud, environmental violation, and falsification of legal documents. The footage of him being led away in handcuffs aired during the evening news, but Evelyn didn't watch it live. She was sitting on the porch, staring at the ridge where rain had begun to fall again after a long, dry spell. The ground trembled faintly beneath her feet, a sound like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. She followed it to the site of the old basin, now cracked and fractured from the fire. Water glistened between the fissures, bubbling up in thin silver threads. At first she thought it was just rainwater seeping through, but when she knelt and touched it, the liquid was warm, alive, flowing upward with pressure. The earth had broken the seal on its own. She sank to her knees, tears blurring her vision as the first true stream in months burst free, spilling over the edges of the ruined slab. It ran down the slope, gathering strength as it moved until it reached the hollow and began to sing again. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the spring's voice returning, defying concrete and greed and the arrogance of men who thought they could silence the earth. When Marissa and Lisa arrived later that evening, they found her still there, soaked and trembling, a smile on her face that was both weary and radiant. The investigation would drag on for months, the lawsuits for years, but in that moment none of it mattered. The spring was back, and with it came the promise that some things, once awakened, never die quietly. Evelyn looked at the water flowing past her boots, reflecting the dim light of the overcast sky, and whispered, "You made it." She thought of her husband, her neighbors, every voice that had been silenced, and she felt the weight of their faith, pressing gently on her shoulders. The world would call it justice, but to her it was something older and more intimate. A resurrection, an answer from the earth itself. The HOA had tried to own the water, to patent life, and the land had answered with rebellion. Standing in the rain, Evelyn knew that she had not just defended a spring, she had defended the heartbeat of her home, and it had chosen to live. Spring returned to the valley not as an event, but as a slow, deliberate awakening, the kind that seemed to exhale through the soil and breathe life back into everything that had withered. The air changed first, moist, fragrant, heavy with the scent of moss and clay. Then came the sound, that soft, persistent murmur of running water threading through the silence like a melody rediscovered. The gray concrete that had once entombed the spring lay shattered in uneven slabs, overrun by green shoots that pushed through the cracks. The people who had once turned away now gathered near the water's edge, some with pails and jars, others simply standing in quiet disbelief. No one spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The valley had remembered what it was. Evelyn watched them from a short distance, her coat draped loosely over her shoulders, her hair silver in the sunlight. For the first time in months, she felt warmth that wasn't anger or exhaustion, but peace, cautious and unfamiliar, as if her body had forgotten how to hold it. The months that followed blurred into a rhythm of restoration. Volunteers from nearby towns helped clear debris, university researchers studied the spring's recovery, and the county declared it a protected heritage site. The name Marsh Spring appeared on new signs at the roadside, embossed in clean bronze letters that caught the morning light. The lawsuits continued in their slow, bureaucratic dance, but they no longer frightened her. Glenn Reed's conviction came quietly, a short article buried near the end of the local paper. But Evelyn didn't need headlines to know the story had ended. He had spent his final moments of power surrounded by lies. She had spent hers surrounded by truth. She often found herself sitting on the old stone where the basin had been, a mug of tea warming her hands, listening to the steady pulse beneath her feet. The water seemed to run clearer now, brighter somehow, as if the earth had filtered out the memory of human cruelty. Children returned to play along the banks where their parents once filled buckets, their laughter carrying across the valley like an echo of something ancient. Thomas rebuilt the wooden trough that guided the overflow toward his farm, just as Evelyn's husband had done decades ago. Lisa moved on to another story, but she called often, her voice lighter each time, her faith in good outcomes renewed. Sometimes Evelyn thought of the fire, the nights of fear, the endless walls of silence that had surrounded her, and she marveled at how small those walls looked now compared to the open landscape before her. One evening she placed a new plaque beside the water, carved simply with the words, "May truth flow forever." As she stood there, the reflection of the setting sun rippled across the surface, painting her face in gold and rose. The valley was quiet except for the steady song of the spring, patient and eternal, and for the first time in a long while, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that she had not just saved the water, she had restored its soul, and in doing so, reclaimed her own.